The night I discovered my college fund was gone was the same night my grandmother quietly decided that the truth would not stay hidden in our family any longer. I remember staring at the number on the screen, refreshing the account page 3 times because it simply didn't make sense. For as long as I could remember, my parents had talked about my college fund like it was a promise written in stone. My name was supposed to be attached to it. $187,000 carefully saved over the years, birthdays, holidays, small deposits my grandmother said she'd been making since I was a toddler. That money wasn't just numbers on a statement. It was my future. Or at least, that's what I believed growing up in our quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Grove, where everyone seemed to know everyone else and family reputations traveled faster than the morning mail. My name is Emily Carter, and for 18 years I thought my parents believed in my future the same way I did. I studied hard, stayed out of trouble, and worked part-time at a small coffee shop downtown to save for books and living expenses once I started college. I wasn't asking my parents for luxury or anything fancy. I just trusted that the college fund they had talked about my entire life would be there when the time came. That evening, I had logged into the account because my university's financial office needed confirmation of available funds before finalizing my enrollment paperwork. I expected to see the familiar number we'd discussed for years, something close to $187,000. Instead, the balance read $0.00. At first I assumed it was a technical mistake. Banks have glitches, right? I refreshed the page again. Still zero. My heart started beating harder as a strange feeling crept in, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before your mind fully understands why. I walked into the kitchen where my parents were sitting at the table with my younger brother Jason. The room smelled like roasted chicken and garlic bread, the kind of ordinary family dinner that had always felt safe to me. I held my phone in my hand and asked a simple question that should have had a simple answer. Why is my college fund empty? My father didn't respond right away. My mother avoided my eyes. Jason suddenly became very interested in the pattern on the tablecloth. The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have, and that was the moment I realized something in our family had already changed long before I noticed. What I didn't know yet was that my grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, had just walked into the house through the back door carrying a pie she'd baked that afternoon. And before that night was over, she would hear everything. The silence at the kitchen table felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced in our home, and in that moment I understood that the answer I was about to hear would change the way I looked at my family forever. My father finally cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair as if the question I had asked was somehow unreasonable. My mother folded her hands together on the table, staring down at them instead of looking at me. Jason shifted in his seat, avoiding my eyes completely. I held my phone up again and repeated the question, slower this time, because part of me still believed there had to be a logical explanation. I asked why my college fund showed a balance of $0 when it had always been described as $187,000 set aside for my education. My father sighed like someone being asked to explain something obvious. He said that technically the money had not disappeared, it had simply been used for something more important. I felt a strange chill move through my chest when he said those words. I asked him what he meant by more important, and that was when my mother finally spoke. She said that Jason had recently been accepted into a very competitive engineering program at a university 3 states away and that the tuition there was extremely expensive. She explained it carefully, almost like she expected me to understand immediately. She said the family had decided that the money would help Jason more than it would help me. For a moment I thought she must be joking, because the idea sounded so absurd that my mind refused to process it. I reminded them that the money had always been described as my college fund. I reminded them of the conversations we had every year about how that money would help me graduate without debt. My father shrugged. In a slow, casual way that made the room feel even colder. He said that families sometimes had to make practical decisions and that Jason's future would benefit more from the investment. Jason finally looked up at that point, but he did not look embarrassed or uncomfortable. Instead, he looked almost relieved that the conversation had been spoken out loud. He said he had not asked for the money directly, but since it was already available, it made sense to use it where it would have the biggest impact. I felt like the floor beneath the kitchen tiles had suddenly shifted. I asked them if they were saying that the entire $187,000 had already been transferred to Jason's tuition account. My mother nodded slowly. She explained that the payment had been completed 2 weeks earlier and that it covered his first year of tuition, housing, and other academic costs. The words sounded calm and reasonable when she said them, but inside my mind something was cracking open piece by piece. I asked them why no one had told me before the money was moved. My father said they had planned to explain it eventually, but they thought it would be easier once Jason's acceptance was finalized. That was when I heard the faint creak of the back door opening behind me. None of us turned around yet, but I knew exactly who it had to be. My grandmother Margaret often used the back entrance whenever she visited, especially when she was carrying food she had baked. What my parents did not realize in that moment was that she had stepped quietly into the hallway and had already heard enough of the conversation to understand what had been done. And my grandmother was not the kind of woman who ignored something when she believed it was wrong. For several seconds no one at the table realized that my grandmother had already stepped into the hallway just beyond the kitchen doorway, but I could sense her presence the way you notice a shift in the air before a summer storm. I was still standing there holding my phone while my parents calmly explained how the $187,000 that had been promised for my education had already been transferred to cover Jason's tuition. The words sounded unreal, like a conversation that belonged to someone else's life. I asked them again if they truly believed it was fair to take money that had always been described as my college fund and give it entirely to my brother without even telling me first. My mother spoke in the same measured tone she used whenever she believed she was being reasonable. She said that life was not always perfectly balanced and that sometimes parents had to support the child who needed the most opportunity at a particular moment. She explained that Jason's engineering program required expensive equipment fees and specialized coursework that would cost far more than my degree in communications at the state university 30 miles away. My father nodded as if the explanation should end the conversation. He said that I was practical and responsible and that I would find a way to make college work through scholarships or student loans. Hearing him say that felt like someone quietly rewriting the entire story of my childhood. For years they had told relatives and neighbors that they were proud of the fund they were building for my future. My grandmother herself had contributed money on birthdays and holidays because she believed she was helping me attend college without financial stress. Now my parents were talking about the same money as if it had always belonged to the family rather than to me. Jason finally spoke again and said that everyone needed to calm down because this situation was not as dramatic as I was making it seem. He said that once he graduated and found a good job he could always help me later if I still needed financial support. The way he said it sounded less like a promise and more like a casual suggestion. I remember looking around the kitchen at the familiar cabinets, the same wooden table where we had eaten dinner together thousands of times, and realizing that the place suddenly felt unfamiliar. It was like discovering that a house you thought was built on solid ground had actually been standing on sand the entire time. I asked my parents one last question because I needed to hear their answer clearly. I asked them if they truly believed that Jason deserved the money more than I did. My father did not hesitate. He said that Jason had chosen a career path with higher earning potential and that supporting that path would benefit the family more in the long run. My mother quietly agreed. That was the moment my grandmother stepped fully into the kitchen carrying the pie she had baked earlier that afternoon. She set it gently on the counter and looked from one face to another before her eyes finally rested on me. My parents had not realized she had been listening, but my grandmother Margaret Whitmore had always been a woman who noticed more than people expected. She asked in a calm voice what exactly she had just heard about my college fund being transferred to Jason. The room became silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight because everyone in that house understood one very important truth about my grandmother. When Margaret Whitmore believed something was wrong, she did not simply forget about it and move on. My parents looked genuinely surprised when they saw my grandmother standing there in the kitchen, as if the simple act of her hearing the conversation had never crossed their minds. Margaret Whitmore was 72 years old, but she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent an entire lifetime watching people carefully before speaking. She glanced at the pie she had placed on the counter, then back at my father. In a quiet voice she asked him to repeat exactly what he had just said about my college fund. My father shifted slightly in his chair and forced a small smile that looked more uncomfortable than polite. He told her it was simply a family decision about education expenses and that everything had already been handled. My grandmother did not move from where she stood. She asked another question, slower this time, asking if the $187,000 that had been set aside for my education had truly been transferred to Jason without my knowledge. My mother quickly stepped in and tried to soften the explanation, saying that the family had only been trying to support the child whose academic program required the most financial resources. She added that Emily would still have many opportunities through scholarships, grants, and part-time work. My grandmother listened without interrupting, which was something she often did when she wanted people to reveal more than they intended. Jason cleared his throat and added that his engineering program required specialized courses, expensive textbooks, and housing near the campus several states away, and that the money would help him focus fully on his studies. The explanation seemed rehearsed, like a speech he had practiced earlier. My grandmother nodded slowly as if she understood every word. Then she asked a question that made the room grow quiet again. She asked whether any of them had informed her that the money she had contributed to that fund for nearly 18 years had been redirected to someone else. My father hesitated for the first time since the conversation began. He explained that technically the money had been placed into a general family savings account years ago, which meant it could legally be used for any educational purpose. The explanation sounded careful and technical, but it did not seem to impress my grandmother at all. She walked over to the kitchen table and sat down across from my parents, folding her hands calmly in front of her. She reminded them that every birthday card she had given me since childhood had included a small contribution to what she believed was Emily's college fund. She said she had always trusted that the money would help me begin my adult life without unnecessary financial burdens. My mother tried to reassure her by saying that the family would always support Emily emotionally and that student loans were a normal part of higher education for many young adults. My grandmother gave a small thoughtful nod as if she were considering that idea. Then she turned her eyes toward me and asked gently if anyone had asked for my opinion before the money was transferred. I shook my head because the truth was obvious to everyone in the room. She looked back at my parents again and her expression remained calm, but there was a quiet determination behind her voice when she spoke next. She said that families sometimes make decisions quickly, but decisions involving promises and trust should never be taken lightly. My father attempted to close the conversation by saying that the situation had already been finalized and that there was no reason to continue discussing it. My grandmother stood up from the table slowly and reached for her purse near the doorway. Before leaving the kitchen she paused and looked at each of us once more. She said that perhaps the decision had already been finalized for tonight, but she believed there were still many details about the situation that deserved a closer look. And anyone who knew Margaret Whitmore well understood that when she said she intended to look more closely at something, it meant the story was far from over. That night after my grandmother left the house, the kitchen felt strangely quiet, as if the air itself had changed. My parents tried to act as though the conversation had simply ended and that everything would return to normal by the next morning. My mother cut a slice of the pie my grandmother had brought and placed it in front of me with the same careful movements she used during every family dinner, but nothing about the moment felt normal anymore. I barely tasted the dessert because my mind kept returning to the same thought over and over again. The $187,000 that had been promised for my future had already been given away, and my parents spoke about it as if the decision had always been obvious. After dinner I went upstairs to my room and sat on the edge of my bed staring at the acceptance letter from the State University 30 miles away. For years I had imagined what it would feel like to begin that next chapter of my life with confidence and excitement. Instead, I felt uncertainty pressing down on me like a weight I could not lift. Meanwhile, across town, my grandmother Margaret Whitmore was sitting at her own kitchen table with a small notebook open in front of her. Anyone who knew my grandmother understood that she was not the type of person who reacted quickly or emotionally. She believed that the best way to understand a situation was to examine it carefully piece by piece. That night she began writing down everything she could remember about the college fund she had been contributing to for nearly 18 years. She listed the birthday cards she had sent me, the holiday envelopes, and the small checks she had mailed whenever she heard that another deposit was being made for my future. The more she thought about it, the more determined she became to understand exactly how the money had been moved without anyone mentioning it to her or to me. Early the next morning she drove to the local bank branch where the original account had been opened. Many years earlier. The teller at the front desk recognized her immediately because Margaret Whitmore had lived in our town longer than most of the employees who worked there. She greeted them politely and asked if she could speak with someone about the history of an education savings account connected to the Carter family. The conversation that followed was quiet and professional, but my grandmother paid close attention to every detail she was given. She learned that the account had indeed been transferred several weeks earlier into a different account used to pay tuition for Jason's university program. The transaction itself was technically allowed because my parents had been listed as the primary account holders. However, the records also showed something my parents had never mentioned during the dinner conversation. A significant portion of the money had originally been deposited through checks that clearly included my grandmother's name as the contributor. When she left the bank that morning, she was not angry in the loud, dramatic way people sometimes expect from family conflicts. Instead, she carried the calm focus of someone who had just confirmed that a promise had been quietly broken. As she drove back through the streets of our small town, she began thinking carefully about what should happen next, because Margaret Whitmore believed that when the truth about a situation mattered, it deserved to be seen clearly by more than just the people sitting around one kitchen table. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in our house became strangely quiet, as if everyone was pretending that the conversation about the college fund had never happened. My parents moved through their routines as usual, my father leaving early for work and my mother busy with errands and phone calls, while Jason spent most of his time talking excitedly about the university he would soon attend 3 states away. He discussed dorm rooms, campus tours, and engineering labs as though the future had already unfolded perfectly for him. Every time he mentioned those plans, I felt a tight knot form in my chest, not because I wanted to take anything away from him, but because I could not ignore the fact that my own future had suddenly become uncertain. I spent hours researching scholarship applications and financial aid programs, trying to calculate how many student loans I might need if I still wanted to attend the state university. 30 miles from home. Meanwhile, my grandmother Margaret Whitmore continued quietly gathering information in her own careful way. The morning after visiting the bank, she drove to the small legal office that had helped her organize her estate paperwork several years earlier. The lawyer who greeted her had known our family for decades, and he welcomed her warmly into his office. My grandmother explained that she needed clarification about the legal structure of an education savings account she had contributed to for many years. She asked detailed questions about ownership, beneficiary rights, and the responsibilities of the account holders when outside family members had regularly added funds for a specific purpose. The lawyer reviewed the documents available in the bank records my grandmother had requested earlier that morning. After examining the details, he explained that while my parents had technically been allowed to move the funds because they controlled the account, the situation was ethically complicated because many of the contributions had clearly been intended for my education. My grandmother listened carefully without showing much emotion, but anyone who knew her could recognize the quiet focus behind her calm expression. She thanked the lawyer for his time and left the office with a clearer understanding of exactly how the money had been transferred. That afternoon, she stopped by the local community center where a planning committee was preparing for the annual Cedar Grove Summer Gathering, an event that brought together most of the town for music, food, and neighborhood announcements. My grandmother had volunteered at the gathering for many years, usually helping organize the dessert tables or greeting visitors at the entrance. As she spoke with several of her longtime friends on the committee, she mentioned that she planned to attend again this year and might have something important she wanted to share with the community during the open announcements portion of the event. No one thought much of the comment at the time because Margaret Whitmore was known for speaking about local history, school programs, and charitable efforts. However, inside her mind a much more specific plan had already begun forming. She believed that promises within a family carried weight beyond private conversations, especially when those promises involved trust and the contributions of many years. And if that trust had been quietly ignored, she believed the truth deserved to be spoken clearly where it could not be dismissed or forgotten. By the time she drove home that evening, the sun was setting over the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, and my grandmother had already decided exactly when the right moment would arrive. As the days passed, the quiet tension in our family continued to grow, even though no one spoke openly about what had happened to the college fund. My parents behaved as though the matter had already been settled, and that time would slowly make everyone forget the uncomfortable conversation in the kitchen. Jason continued preparing for his move to the engineering university several states away, proudly showing relatives the campus brochure and the housing confirmation he had received in the mail. Whenever he talked about his future, my parents smiled in the satisfied way people do when they believe they have made the correct decision. I tried to focus on my own plans, filling out scholarship applications and calculating possible student loans, but every step felt heavier than it had just a few weeks earlier. Meanwhile, my grandmother Margaret Whitmore moved quietly through town with the calm patience she had always been known for. She did not call my parents to argue, and she did not confront them again about the decision they had made. Instead, she continued helping the volunteers organize the upcoming Cedar Grove Summer Gathering, an annual event that brought together families, local businesses, teachers, and neighbors from all around the community. The gathering had been part of the town's tradition for decades, and my grandmother had volunteered there almost every year since I was a child. This year the event was scheduled to take place in the large park near the community center, where rows of folding chairs and long picnic tables would be arranged beneath colorful banners and strings of small lights. There would be music, homemade food, and a short portion of the evening set aside for announcements and community recognition. On the morning of the event, my parents seemed excited because Jason had been invited to stand with several other graduating students who were heading off to universities in the fall. They believed it would be a proud moment for our family to see him recognized in front of the town. My grandmother arrived early that afternoon carrying a few dessert trays she had baked for the event. She greeted neighbors warmly, helped arrange the tables, and spoke with the organizing committee about the order of announcements that would be made later in the evening. When she asked if she could briefly speak during the open microphone portion, no one questioned the request because Margaret Whitmore had been a respected member of the community for many years. As the sun began to set, the park slowly filled with familiar faces from around Cedar Grove. Children ran between the tables while adults greeted one another and shared stories about the past year. Music drifted softly through the warm evening air, and the atmosphere felt relaxed and celebratory. My parents sat together near the front row while Jason stood proudly with the group of students who would soon be leaving for college. I stayed nearby, trying to smile politely whenever someone congratulated our family. Then the announcer stepped forward to begin the short recognition ceremony for graduating seniors. One by one students were called forward and the crowd applauded as their plans for the future were read aloud. When Jason's name was announced, my parents clapped enthusiastically while he walked toward the front of the small stage area. After the recognition ended, the announcer thanked everyone for attending and reminded the crowd that there was still time for a few community announcements before the evening music began. At that moment, my grandmother Margaret Whitmore slowly stood from her seat and walked toward the microphone with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly what she intended to say next. The moment my grandmother Margaret Whitmore stepped up to the microphone, the casual noise of the Cedar Grove summer gathering softened into curious silence because most people in town recognized her immediately. She smiled politely at the crowd and thanked everyone for coming out to support the graduating students and the local community programs. Her voice sounded calm and steady, the same voice that had greeted neighbors at church events and school fundraisers for decades. My parents relaxed slightly when they heard her begin that way, probably assuming she intended to share one of her usual comments about supporting education or helping young people pursue their goals. Jason was still standing near the front with the other graduates, smiling proudly while a few neighbors continued to congratulate him on his acceptance into the engineering program. My grandmother paused for a moment and looked across the rows of familiar faces, people who had known our family for many years. Then she said something that immediately changed the mood of the entire park. She said that before the music began she wanted to tell a short story about a promise that had been made in this town many years ago. The crowd listened politely because stories were not unusual during community gatherings, but I noticed my parents glance at each other with quiet uncertainty. My grandmother explained that when her granddaughter Emily had been a small child, the family had begun saving money for a college education. She spoke clearly so everyone could hear her across the rows of chairs and picnic tables. She described how relatives had contributed small amounts over the years, birthday checks, holiday gifts, and savings meant to help one young woman begin adulthood without the heavy burden of debt. A few people in the audience nodded because they remembered those conversations. My grandmother continued speaking calmly as she explained that the fund had eventually grown to $187,000. At that point my father shifted in his chair and my mother's expression became noticeably tense. My grandmother then said that recently she had learned something surprising about that promise. She told the crowd that the money which had been described for years as Emily's college fund had quietly been transferred to pay for another student's tuition without Emily ever being informed ahead of time. A murmur moved through the audience as neighbors exchanged uncertain looks. My grandmother did not raise her voice or accuse anyone directly. She simply explained the sequence of events the way someone might present the facts of a simple misunderstanding. She mentioned that she herself had contributed many checks to that fund because she believed it would help her granddaughter attend college with confidence and independence. Then she said that she had visited the bank earlier that week and confirmed that the entire amount had been redirected to cover Jason's engineering program several states away. The quiet murmur in the crowd grew louder as people began to understand exactly what she was describing. My grandmother finally looked toward where my parents were sitting and spoke in the same calm tone she had used the entire time. She said that families sometimes make complicated decisions, but she believed promises should be honored openly, especially when they involve trust built over many years. Then she turned toward me, standing a few rows behind the chairs, and said that every young person in Cedar Grove deserved a fair chance to pursue an education without having their future quietly rearranged by someone else's decision. By the time she stepped away from the microphone, the entire park had grown unusually quiet, because everyone in that small town now understood exactly what had happened to the $187,000 that was once meant to be my college fund. For a few long seconds after my grandmother stepped away from the microphone, the entire park remained quiet in a way that I had never experienced before at any Cedar Grove gathering. Conversations that had filled the air only moments earlier faded into a low murmur as neighbors slowly processed what they had just heard. People who had known my family for years looked back and forth between my parents, Jason, and me with expressions that were not angry but clearly unsettled. My father sat very still in his chair, staring toward the stage as if he hoped the moment would somehow pass without anyone speaking about it again. My mother forced a small smile whenever someone nearby glanced in her direction, but it was the kind of smile people use when they know something uncomfortable has already become impossible to hide. Jason shifted awkwardly among the group of students who had been recognized earlier, suddenly unsure whether he should remain standing there or quietly return to his seat. I stood a few rows back watching the entire scene unfold, feeling a mixture of relief and disbelief because for the first time since that night in our kitchen the truth had been spoken openly where no one could pretend it was simply a misunderstanding. My grandmother walked calmly back toward the dessert tables where she had been helping earlier, greeting neighbors with the same polite warmth she always showed at community events. She did not look dramatic or angry. Instead, she looked like someone who had simply finished explaining an important detail that everyone deserved to know. Within minutes, small conversations began spreading through the crowd as neighbors discussed what had just been revealed. Cedar Grove was the kind of town where people valued fairness and honesty, and the idea that a promise made to a child had quietly been redirected without her knowledge clearly troubled many of them. Several people approached me gently to say that they were sorry I had experienced something so difficult and that they admired how calmly my grandmother had handled the situation. Eventually the evening music began playing again, but the cheerful atmosphere from earlier had changed into something more thoughtful and reflective. Later that night, as the event slowly came to an end, my grandmother walked over to where I was standing near the edge of the park. She looked at me with the same steady kindness she had shown throughout my entire life and told me that no matter what decisions other people had made, my future still mattered. She explained that education had always been important in our family and that she had already begun making arrangements to ensure I would have the opportunity to attend college without carrying the full weight of the situation alone. She did not describe every detail of her plan that evening, but her confidence made it clear that she intended to keep the promise she had believed in for so many years. As we left the park together under the soft glow of the streetlights, I realized that while the events of the past week had revealed painful truths about trust and fairness, they had also shown me something equally powerful. In a small town where reputations travel quickly and promises still carry meaning, one determined grandmother had made sure that honesty would never remain hidden for long.